Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone, depending from where you are joining us today. My name is Jose Miguel Bermudez. I'm an energy analyst here at the IEA working on hydrogen technologies, and I will have the pleasure of moderating this last session of today's Low Carbon Gas Day, in which we will have a series of speakers discussing about the regulatory aspects of this endeavor of adopting low carbon gases as part of our energy systems. In the sessions of this morning, we heard the speakers explaining which could be the role of these low carbon gases in the clean energy transition, and what kind of infrastructure we will need to put in place, and which opportunities and challenges we are facing to leverage existing natural gas infrastructure in this transition. Well, we can consider those aspects as the game in which we are engaging, and this session is going to be about the rules of that game, which is regulation. We need to put in place a regulatory basis that can enable the integration of these low carbon gases in the energy system, and therefore facilitate their scale up both in production and use. The adoption of existing regulatory frameworks is an urgent task to be undertaken to make sure that stakeholders are aware of the rules of this game and how they will need to follow those rules to operate in this new scenario. This is extremely important, since this is what they need to know how to develop their long-term plans, the new business models for implementing or for adopting these low carbon gases. Many regions in the world are already developing their thinking on these matters and how to adapt the regulatory framework, but we can all agree that the European Union is ahead of others on this process, and the recent hydrogen and decarbonized gas market package has set the groundwork for the adoption of these existing regulatory frameworks. And with any further ado, I will then pass to our first speaker, Justin Rossing, which is a policy officer in the Directorate General for Energy of the European Commission. Justin, thank you very much for joining us today, and now the floor is yours.
Many thanks, and many thanks for having the opportunity to speak today, indeed, on the package. And I think our Deputy Director General already this morning gave a brief outline and a broader context of the package, and I will try to give some more details of the package and also put it in, let's say, the broader perspective. So yes, the hydrogen and gas markets decarbonization package. If you could go to the next slide, please. As said, I will shortly outline the bigger picture, but I'll keep it short here. I think this is relevant in order to understand the context of the package. If you look at the figure on the left, you see in essence let's say, the three pillars on which the transformation of the European energy system towards zero carbon system in 2050 should be shaped. So energy efficiency first principle lies at the core of the transformation as we envisage it. Secondly, we should accelerate electrification based on renewables. But in those places where electrification is technically not feasible or not a cost-efficient way to decarbonize, we envisage a role for renewable and low carbon fuels, such as hydrogen, in order to transform the system as it should be. On the figure to the right, I shortly explain, let's say, time-wise, how the process has been shaped on our side. So in the summer of 2020, the European Commission released a hydrogen strategy, and this can be considered as a key document to launch actions to increase the role of renewable and low carbon hydrogen into our energy system. In the strategy, we already explained that we see a staged development of the hydrogen sector, and we have adapted our regulatory package to that, and I will explain that in the following slides. So we set strategic targets, the 6 gigawatts electrolyzer targets for 2024, the 40 gigawatts for 2030, which we reinforced with the recently communication Repower EU. And here I want to say that the initial targets, as we put them in the hydrogen strategy, have until now already been met and filled in by national hydrogen strategies of the member states, and also a pipeline of hydrogen projects that is concluded or being developed under the European Clean Hydrogen Alliance, where we already see approximately 56 gigawatts of hydrogen producing products being put forward or on the table for further development. So as said, we have enforced targets in light of the recent developments. And here we more prominently propose to have a role for hydrogen import. And we also acknowledged a potential role for nuclear-based hydrogen in order to ramp up and create the hydrogen market. So a staged development with a focus on hard to decarbonize sectors, also a staged development of the infrastructure. And that brings me to the second slide, which is, let's say, the hydrogen and gas markets decarbonization package. So the next slide, please. So I think it's important to say that the package does not entail concrete measures to tackle CO2 emissions. That's part of many other elements of the Fit for 55 package that the European Commission has launched and which is now being debated by the Parliament and the member states. But the aim of our package is to create the right condition for the access of renewable and low carbon gases, primarily hydrogen, to the European infrastructure and to the market. So in order for these gases to really step up and play a role in the system. So the package has in essence 4 targets. We want to enable the development of a dedicated hydrogen infrastructure, which allows hydrogen to become a key component of the energy system. As has been said already by previous speakers, and most of us will be aware of, hydrogen in its dedicated form is, let's say, the best way forwards, and would, in terms of CO2, decreasing CO2 emissions and cost efficiency, be the most valuable way of using the commodity in the system. So that's why we aim for a dedicated hydrogen infrastructure and market. But some member states might choose for another pathway. And that's why we also created rules on facilitating access into the existing natural gas system for renewable and low carbon gases. So that's the second goal. Thirdly, and I think we already had a presentation in this regard by Mr. Brabo explaining the Danish situation. What we also envisage with our package or aim to realize is a more integrated network planning between the different energy vectors, electricity, gas, and hydrogen, primarily at national level, and I'll come back to that as well. And lastly, we would like to improve and promote consumer engagement in the renewable and low carbon gas markets. Next slide, please. So the policy aim. Next slide, please. In this regard, I think this is the core of the package. We have proposed in our package, let's say, network market principles that are already proven, have already been proven to help the right development of the natural gas and electricity market. And we have shaped a package that is centered around these principles. Principles like third-party access, vertical unbundling, horizontal unbundling, tariff regimes, transparency, and network planning. But we have decided in our package to propose the application of these rules in 2 phases. So a situation until 2030 and a situation after 2030. So the principles, as we propose them, should be commensurate with the stage development of the hydrogen system. So with regard to third-party access, we have proposed that member states have the option to go for negotiated access to the networks, the infrastructure. This means that the users and the operators of the networks can, on a commercial basis, agree on the tariffs set to use the network. With regard to unbundling, in our view, we start with a greenfield situation in the sense that there is not hydrogen regulation yet. So that's why we have chosen a vertical unbundling system in which we leave all options with regard to vertical unbundling open until 2030. So ownership unbundling, the ITO system and the ISO system. But after 2030, the default rule with regard to unbundling should be ownership unbundling. Obviously, repurposing natural gas pipelines for transport of hydrogen is within the European Union system considered to be the most cost-effective way of creating hydrogen transport infrastructure. So there might be a role to play for incumbent natural gas operators to play a role. So what we have proposed here is also to apply the horizontal unbundling principle, which means that the activities with regard to the operation of natural gas and hydrogen systems, would they take place within a single company, should be legally separated. This is also to uphold the principle, as we know it already today in the electricity and gas markets, that tariffs should be cost reflective. But then again, we know that there isn't a large customer base yet for the hydrogen and network operators on the basis of which they could create tariffs. So for the intermediate period, we do allow the cross-subsidization of hydrogen networks via monies that are levied on natural gas users. But we have proposed very strict conditions in this regard, which means that in essence, these conditions are that it should be followed. There's regulatory approval needed in this regard. These levies can, or these cross-border cross-sectoral subsidies cannot be levied on external users of the network. And we have set a time limit to the option of cross-financing of hydrogen networks. We also know that alongside a hydrogen backbone, various configurations of the hydrogen network will develop until 2030. So we already have today existing private hydrogen networks, and these will be exempted from the regulatory regime, especially the vertical unbundling rules and TPA rules. But this is also made, we have also linked it here to criteria, which mean that once the existing private networks would enter into an integrated, interconnected system, their exemptions would cease to end. We also have a cutoff date for these exemptions in 2030. And would these networks be expanded, then their exemptions would also end. So for the end phase, a regulated TPA regime, a vertical unbundling system based on ownership unbundling. For geographically confined networks, which we have defined in our regulation, an exemption from the vertical unbundling principle would still be possible. But that would only be also under the condition that no new hydrogen production plant would be connected to the network. And lastly, we also, and I think that's an important element to take into account, propose the equal regulatory regime for intra-EU and import pipelines. So the same regulatory provisions would apply to interconnectors. Next slide, please. So I was talking about networks, pipelines, but we also have a regulatory framework that should cater for a role for storage and terminal facilities. In this regard, I think it's important to say what we mean with hydrogen storage facilities. We mostly mean with this large-scale underground storage facilities, which can or may develop as a natural monopoly. They are, as far as is known until today, not largely available throughout Europe, mostly in the northwest of Europe. So in essence, they are a real natural monopoly. They might have an important system function for the hydrogen system. And in that regard, for, let's say, large-scale underground storage facilities, we have proposed a regulated TPA regime. I want to state that easily replicable above-ground storage facilities do not fall in the scope of the regulation as we have envisaged it. Then for hydrogen terminals, as said, we see an important role for import. So terminals will play an important role to create a hydrogen market within Europe. And hence we have proposed TPA regime for hydrogen terminals as well. But because the actual role of terminals is to a certain extent uncertain today, we have chosen a light TPA regime. And lastly, hydrogen can be imported via these terminals, but also via pipelines. So we expect enough competition to take place. And in that regard, a different infrastructure or transport option will exert enough competitive pressure to each other. And that's why we think that for hydrogen terminals, a lighter TPA regime would be justified. Next slide, please. Certification of low carbon hydrogen and synthetic fuels. I think it was important to also spend some attention to that, because after all, it's a low carbon hydrogen day. And although our focus within the European Commission and that we propose to the member states is mostly about renewable hydrogen, we also have envisaged a definition for low carbon hydrogen in the hydrogen and gas markets decarbonization package. It's also good to say that the definition for renewable hydrogen has already been included in the Renewable Energy Directive. That's another legal instrument that was proposed already summer last year. And we have also included targets for renewable hydrogen in the industrial and transport sector. But for low carbon hydrogen, we think there's a need to define them and also find a way to find a methodology to calculate the CO2 abatement one can reach with these type of gases. So that's why we also envisage a system for low carbon hydrogen. Some member states might decide to make it part of their decarbonization measures, to let low carbon hydrogen play a role in their decarbonization measures. And that's also a reason why we thought it's important to define it. Similar to renewable hydrogen, in order to estimate the greenhouse gas emission reduction threshold, we propose to apply a life cycle emission approach. And the methodology will be further defined in a delegated act that should be adopted by the end of 2024. And as said, the methodology and the greenhouse gas emission reduction threshold should be similar to that of renewable hydrogen, and should be further developed in the delegated act. Next slide, please. Policy aim 2, facilitating the access of renewable and low carbon gases to the existing gas network. Next slide, please. As I said in the beginning, some member states might decide for another pathway, which is the integration of renewable and low carbon gases in the existing network. So not opt for a dedicated hydrogen grid, but obviously decarbonized gases, low carbon renewable gases do not only entail hydrogen, but also we envisage a strong role for biomethane and biogases, which was once more also endorsed by the communication that was launched on the 8th of March by the European Commission, in which we set a strategic target for biomethane and biogas. What we have proposed with regards to, well, let's say this pathway is that we will remove cross-border for tariffs for these gases, and we will significantly reduce other tariffs at the entry point of existing gas networks. That should allow for an efficient cross-border trade and it should support the upscale and access of renewable and low-carbon gases to the existing natural gas market, because we know that nowadays gases like biogas are produced domestically, and with the measures and that we propose, we aim to give these type of gases better access to the wholesale market in order for them to step up. We also improve our framework on LNG and gas storages. It should ensure a higher level of transparency and a more efficient use. And where possible, we want these operators to show whether there are capacities available for the import of renewable and low carbon gases. So as said, our key goal is a dedicated use of hydrogen, but some member states might not have dedicated hydrogen networks. So that's why we also introduced a 5% allowed cap of hydrogen blends within the existing natural gas network at interconnection points between member states. And this is merely to avoid that cross-border flow restrictions due to differences in blending levels between member states might arise. So network operators have to accept this cap, but it's very important to state that we don't want to go for a blending obligation. It's merely to ensure that if member states choose for it, it doesn't lead to market fragmentation, or that apart from that, the quality of the gas, which physically changes obviously due to a potential blending of hydrogen, is kept in line with the needs of end users. And lastly, it's linked to the point I already made. We would like to have to create more transparency on the use of capacities at LNG terminals and gas storages to allow more trading and a flexible renewable and low carbon gas trade. Next slide, please. Fostering network planning between different energy vectors is another important policy aim of our package. Next slide, please. I think it's important to outline the key characteristics of integrated network planning, which is shown on this slide. So I'll explain it clockwise, starting upper left. What we have proposed is that at member states level, there will be a single network development plan of all gas TSOs, and that network plan should be based on a joint scenario that is developed on a cross-sectoral basis, which means that the electricity TSOs, the natural gas TSOs, and to the extent they exist, also the hydrogen network operators should depart from the same scenario. And this is a practice that we already know at European level. So we want to bring that practice also to national level. In light of the fact that repurposing of natural gas infrastructure for hydrogen transport is the best way forward, we oblige natural gas network operators to include information on infrastructure that can or will be decommissioned and can potentially be repurposed for the transport of hydrogen. So this is about network planning for natural gas network operators. And alongside this, we have a specific provision in our package that hydrogen network operators, dedicated hydrogen network operators, should report on the development of the hydrogen network. So in comparison with the natural gas network development plan, we don't ask for a full-fledged plan because there's not a full-fledged infrastructure and market available yet, but to indicate in a report information on the development of the hydrogen network. This is primarily to create transparency for potential users of the network to make investment decisions, but it's also meant to support the PCI process, a process to select projects of common European interest, which is an instrument under the recently revised European 10E regulation, focusing on stimulating the creation of European infrastructure, energy infrastructure. And since that proposal, also dedicated hydrogen networks are a PCI category. So with the reports, we aim to also support the PCI selection process at European level. Lastly, a reason to go for a report rather than a plan is that we envisage a negotiated TPA regime initially for the hydrogen network. So in essence, there's not a need to have a full-fledged plan yet, because there's not an obligation yet for network operators to actually perform the investments that they have reported in their plan. So that justifies also a reporting obligation. Lastly, both this hydrogen network report as well as the natural gas network development plan should be aligned with the policies that member states have included in their national energy and climate plans, the NECPs, which outlines how member states will realize the European targets with regards to climate neutrality, the 2030 target, energy efficiency, and renewables primarily. So that about fostering network planning. Next slide, please. That's the last aim of our policy package, which is to improve and promote consumer engagement. And I can be very quick here. What we aim to reach with our package is that hydrogen will mostly be used in the industrial and transport sector. And that's why we will also propose targets in the Renewable Energy Directive. But we think that basic consumer rights should also be applied to renewable and low carbon gases. Next slide, please. So what we envisage in our package is to bring consumer provisions, as we already know them in the European electricity regulation, in line to bring these consumer provisions as we know them in the electricity market, also to the natural gas markets. We have proposed in our rules a clear framework for member states if they wish to set prices for energy poor and vulnerable customers, as well as households and micro enterprises. And for hydrogen, and that's linked to what I just tried to say, we have only included basic consumer rights because in essence, we do not really want to promote the use of hydrogen in the residential sector, because in the short run, as said, we envisage its role primarily to play in the industrial and transport sector. So these are the 4 targets of our package. And it's good to say that we have launched it in December, and it's now up to the European Parliament and the member states within the Council to pick up our package and to start negotiations. And with this, I end my presentation and I'm open for questions if they are there.
Thank you very much, Justin. We have a few questions. We have 1 minute left for your time, although there will be more time for Q&A afterwards. But maybe let me just ask you the very first one, and we can address the others in the longer Q&A session. So it's from Alexander Barnes. It's a long question, so let me just resume it quickly. Managing risk in developing new supply chains often involves vertical bundling. The current gas directive allows exceptions, which are often for 20 years or so, but under the hydrogen rules, it will allow a maximum of 7 years, and there will be very few projects able to take advantage of that on any scales. Mm-hmm. This will not apply to infrastructure within country, hydrogen clusters. So are you risking undermining the development of the market by being too strict?
It's a good question, and it mostly relates to what I tried to say, that we try to create flexibility in our package. It depends a bit on which exemptions you refer to, but let's take vertical unbundling and TPA exemptions into account. As I try to say, for the existing networks, we think that the time path until 2030, and the exemption on vertical unbundling and TPA would sustain. But for some networks, geographically confined networks, we have provisions in our package that still envisage the option to be exempted from the vertical unbundling system also after 2030. And we have set strict criteria for the ending of these regulatory principles. So I think we create quite some flexibility. And with regards to the TPA regime, in essence, it would still be possible under the existing rules or the proposed rules to have contracts that if they are enclosed today or in the upcoming years, there would be the opportunity for them to have a duration longer than 2030. We just say that as of 2030, and contracts that are being enclosed as of then should follow the RTPA regime. So there would still, in our view, also be the opportunity to use flexibility with regard to the application of the TPA principle. But then again, and that's also related because of the we are unknown how the market will develop. We will have a role for the regulator to play to see to what extent long-term contracts under the envisaged initial NTPA regime might lead to a bad situation on the market, and they would have the opportunity to intervene there. So I think also to round up, the most important thing is that we create clarity. We have created regulatory principles. We leave for flexibility on TPA and unbundling. And obviously it's now up to the legislators to decide whether what we have proposed is good enough. But I think there's flexibility and that should help the markets ramp up.
Okay, thank you very much, Justin. There are many other questions, but let's address them in the Q&A session at the end after the rest of the speakers. So thank you very much for the presentation, and let's move now to our next speaker, which is Maria Sicilia, Director of Strategy of Enagas, and who will give us a TSO perspective about the need of low carbon gas regulation. Maria, thank you very much for being today with us, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jose Miguel. It is really an honor to be at this low carbon gas day, which cannot be more timely, and a real pleasure to be back with my former and dear colleagues of the IEA. Should I share my screen in order to, is it?
My colleagues from GCP, they will be sharing the slides for you.
Okay, fine. I just lost my
Just to let you know, we have the slides already in the screen.
Okay, so first slide, please. I cannot see the screen. I don't know why. Okay, now it's back. I hope no. Well, I can see the screen, but first of all, let me just introduce in a couple of minutes Enagas. Enagas is a European TSO at the forefront of the development of renewable gases. Is a company with 50 years experience in transmission, storage and regasification with 6 LNG terminals, which account today for 30% of European annual regasification capacity. We are the technical manager of the Spanish gas system as an independent TSO, and we are also a global midstream company operating in 8 countries. We are fully committed to carbon neutrality by 2040. We have already reduced by 54% our carbon footprint since 2014. And we are driving the development of more than 50 renewable gas projects in Spain, together with numerous partners also in LATAM. We think as a Spanish gas TSO can provide a crucial source of diversification of gas and renewable gas supplies in the future to the European Union, and we can be instrumental in accelerating the transition to domestically produced hydrogen and biomethane. Next slide, please. Just explain with a lot of clarity and detail the content of the European Commission proposal for harmonized regulatory framework, which for low carbon gases, which is absolutely necessary to unlock investment in this market. All the building blocks to meet the Fit for 55 targets are in the Commission proposal. I don't want to, I mean, the unbundling provisions is probably a crucial aspect for TSOs. Although what is more important, and that will be the
Maria, could I interrupt you just for a second? We are having some technical problems because I think you have your screen shared with us, and my colleagues are telling me that they cannot handle the presentation anymore. So I think if you stop sharing, they should be able to run the...
Okay.
Maria, you should have an option on top of your screen.
Okay.
There you go. Yeah, it stopped sharing. So guys, could you please put the presentation? Okay, here you go. That's it. So Maria, could you confirm in which slide do you want us to?
Next slide, please.
The next one. There you go. Apologies for that.
No problem. It is my fault. My apologies. Just briefly highlight that from the TSO perspective, which is crucial from the current proposal, is that the regulatory package lays the foundation for a dedicated pan-European hydrogen network and recognizes a central role for network operators, not only in the transition phase, but also in the future interconnected market. Just next slide, please. However, the Fit for 55 package is not enough to meet the new targets that the Repower EU plan just outlined on March 8 in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. To make Europe independent from fossil fuels well before 2030, and starting with replacing 2/3 of the 155 BCM of natural gas that the European Union currently imports from Russia, is a huge challenge. The current geopolitical context highlights the need to accelerate the clean energy transition and the crucial role renewable gases can play in enhancing energy security in Europe. Repower EU introduces ambitious targets for both biomethane and hydrogen, which go beyond what is contemplated in the Fit for 55 package and in the decarbonisation package. Currently, the EU produces 3 BCM of biomethane and 17 BCM of biogas. These are data from 2020. The Repower EU communication sets a target for 35 BCM biomethane production by 2030, which is an increase of tenfold nearly from current levels in order to meet this target. We know that some of these 35 BCM biomethane could be made by upgrading the existing biogas production to biomethane, but meeting the target will require significant increase as well in production. In terms of hydrogen, the hydrogen accelerator chapter of the Repower EU plan aims to develop infrastructure, storage facilities, and ports and replace demand for Russian gas with an additional 31.6 BCM or 333 terawatts hour of renewable hydrogen, both from domestic production and another amount, such an amount of domestic imported and domestic renewable hydrogen, totaling almost 50 BCM of additional hydrogen in 2030 in BCM in natural gas equivalent. What is clear is that it is imperative that these actions are addressed urgently if we want to meet this target and accelerate also climate action while reducing the current economic burden on households and companies. As a result of the invasion of Ukraine, natural gas prices have increased sixfold from 20 euros megawatt hour to more than 100 euros megawatt hour in just 1 year. This is threatening, of course, the competitiveness of Europe's industry and amplifying the risk of energy poverty. But with biomethane prices today being 50 to 90 euros per megawatt hour, depending on feedstock and plant scale, this is competitive against current natural gas prices. At a natural gas price of 100 euros megawatt hour, the cost of gray hydrogen are around 6 euros per kilogram, while the cost for green hydrogen are today between 3 to 6 euros per kilogram. This indicates that the renewable gases are already cost competitive in the short term, alleviating with capacity to alleviate energy costs for consumers and companies. Two key elements are required from a general perspective to meet this challenge. One is mobilizing and allocating funding to reach the scale required. And we calculate that this means shifting forwards the EU 2050 vision for decarbonized gas consumption to be visible already by 2030. The other element that is a condition sine qua non, a precondition is to have a wide EU-wide certification scheme for renewable and low carbon gases to enable international trade, as Justin just highlighted. But next slide, please. How can on biomethane, what I want to highlight also is that this is a solution for today and not just for the long term. This is readily available. We think that reaching 35 BCM, as stated in the Repower plan, is possible, but needs efforts to boost feedstock supply, and the priority in the short term should be to mobilize waste and residue feedstock with the lowest cost, highest emissions savings. Biomethane is compatible with existing networks. EU biomethane market has shown constant growth, but this is not fast enough to meet the Repower EU goals. France shows us we can get there, as France has been able to boost production capacity tenfold in just 6 years, thanks to a complete policy framework to support the industry, including a feed-in tariff, a 10% renewable gas target, targets for grid injection. But we think that more member states must follow suit. The first step, as I said, is to work on boosting feedstock supply, but also infrastructure will play a crucial role. Careful planning, again, in order to make easy injection in existing gas networks, and some investment will be needed. In addition, wider policy measures to de-risk investment and ensure suitable demand can also contribute to this tenfold scale of biomethane. In terms of hydrogen, next slide. TSOs can definitely play a crucial role in fast-tracking the delivery of a European hydrogen backbone that Justin just outlined how that is included in the vision of the gas decarbonization package. The existing gas infrastructure is the key enabler to unlock the green hydrogen potential in Europe. Then, again, planning and permitting of renewable gas supply infrastructure projects have to be more streamlined. This development of a hydrogen backbone can be driven in two directions. One is a bottom-up approach, creating local valleys, starting with industrial consumption clusters. The other is via top-down coordination at the regional and European level by establishing from the outset plans for a pan-European backbone. Two elements that we shouldn't forget. First of all, the role of Europe to support through common projects of common interest and important projects of common European interest to rapidly develop the infrastructure dedicated to hydrogen transport, including pipelines, underground storage and import terminals. And the other, and I want to highlight as well the role of hydrogen storage. This is a key component of the future hydrogen network that will enable supply and demand balancing for the entire system. And those projects are have long lead times and even more technology and geological risk than any other infrastructure. What needs to be taken, the takeaway from this is that for TSOs to provide this this infrastructure, we need to plan ahead. We need to coordinate this at regional and EU level. Next slide, please. In the case of Spain and Enagas in particular, we are already working with our with neighboring countries in order to create a coordinated network that can provide to Europe a significant contribution to meeting our Repower targets. As shown in the previous slides, Spain and Portugal have the greatest potential for green hydrogen production in the European Union. We are probably or very likely the region with the largest potential for exports compared to our domestic demand to Central European markets. We have been working since the publication of the Repower EU plan on what can be done from the Iberian Peninsula by 2030, and we think that we could develop by then more than 1,400 kilometers of dedicated hydrogen pipelines, mostly from adapted pipelines, but also with new developments, probably also with 1 or 2 hydrogen storages, and this at an affordable cost. With these plans, Spain could provide Europe with 21 BCM or 2 million tons of hydrogen per year, which is nearly 20% of the total forecast in the Repower plan for domestic production by 2030. Again, this requires to develop hydrogen-ready interconnection capacity from France from Spain through France in order to reach Central European countries. This is where the regional coordination is crucial and should be taken into account also in European legislation. Just to conclude, next slide, please. we think from a TSO perspective that our infrastructures can play a long-term role in the security of supply and the decarbonization of the entire energy system. We are ready to transform our core business to the transport of renewable and low carbon gases. The proposals for this, outlined by the EU Commission in the EU Hydrogen and Decarbonized Gas Package, cover many of the measures required to kickstart the renewable and low carbon gas market. We are happy that the central role for hydrogen and for network operators is recognized in the future European legislation that envisages an interconnected low carbon gas market. But the current volatile and energy security situation requires dramatic acceleration of renewable hydrogen and biomethane projects. This is not only crucial for the energy transition, it's a question of security of supply, and it's also key for reducing the bills for gas consumers in Europe. Member states need to develop policy frameworks, starting with biomethane as a readily available vector that can provide a very significant contribution to the Repower EU plan to diversify away from Russian imports. But clearly, bolder policies are needed to mobilize infrastructure investment dedicated to hydrogen. This needs, in our view, coordinated planning, integrated as well in the national development, national climate plans, and at the European level as well. A hydrogen backbone is the end point, and will facilitate a liquid, cost-efficient, and interconnected market. We think as TSOs that our expertise and the ability to repurpose our existing assets are absolutely central to realizing this vision. As Enagas, we are, and from the Spanish perspective, we are ready to work with our colleagues from neighboring countries in developing the gas infrastructures needed to start with this regional integration with the view by 2030, with the view to create an integrated hydrogen union by 2050. And that's all on my side. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Very interesting and much appreciated. I think this time we are going to move directly to our next speaker. There is already a question for you on the Q&A, and I have myself a couple of them, but let's address them on the longer session. And then we can move directly to Christian Carbareto, which is head of SBI and energy transition in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and is going to give us an investor's view of the need of gas pipeline repurposing. Christian, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And as you said before, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone connected to this very interesting event. I'm following the same approach of the previous speaker, so if you guys can share my slides.
We will share them from you, Christian. So
from me, okay, fine.
My colleagues are putting in now.
Okay, it's coming. Yeah.
Here it goes. Yeah.
Here it is. All right. So I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective from the previous two speakers, because the way I put together my presentation was to sit on my chair and look at the role that the financial institutions can have in accelerating the deployment of the infrastructure required to achieve the carbon neutrality targets that we almost everywhere in the countries are putting in place. So if you move to the next slide, please. I think the best point to start from is a very quick overview of our lending approach to carbon and energy intensive sectors in the countries where we work. like many other multilaterals and other commercial banks, we have been called to step up our climate action. And in particular, at the EBRD, we've taken the decision that all our financial flows from the end of this year have to be aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And I think, as in the box that you can read at the top of the slide, emphasis today is not only in financing projects that do not undermine or do not delay this transition, but rather accelerate. So our focus is really much in focusing on the projects that accelerate the transition. And in this context, I think the other important pillar of our approach is that we have committed that at least 50% of our annual business volume is eligible for reporting as climate finance or green finance. So from now on, going forward, with this alignment with the goals of Paris Agreement, the targets on climate finance, and then last but not least, the growing importance in reporting and disclosing climate-related financial risks in our operations clearly put a very clear direction of travel in the context of our discussion today towards decarbonized fuels and decarbonized industrial feedstocks. So if you move to the next slide, when it comes to supporting gas infrastructure, right, because the starting point in this slide is that we are considering infrastructure that at the outset might still be transporting fossil natural gas, and that over the lifetime of the assets will transition away from the fossil feedstock and move towards the decarbonized alternatives. We really much have to be comfortable on the three main pillars that you see at the bottom here. First of all, as I just mentioned, the projects need to be clearly aligned with Paris Agreement, and in particular, help accelerating this pace of decarbonization. Number two, in order to reduce any risk of lock-in for long term on fossil industry, and also prevent the risk that the assets we invest in become stranded, they need to be future-proof, meaning that they need to be designed to be able to transport the low carbon gases we've been discussing about today. And third, notwithstanding this condition of future-proofing, we also need to feel comfortable that the projects implement all the best available solutions to minimize the carbon footprint of the supply chain. This means energy efficiency, in particular in compression stations, but also first and foremost, having a very robust and dependable plan for managing and minimizing methane emissions. So in the next few slides, we'll go a little bit into these three pillars, and then we can close up with your questions. So next one, again, on Paris, I'm not going to enter into the details of the way we screen projects against the objectives of the Paris Agreement. The session today is about regulations. And so, and also, by the way, our methodology has been disclosed publicly for consultation since middle of last year for different components of our financial approaches. So you can also see it, and we can further discuss offline the mechanics. But one important, crucial, I would say, building block is the reliance on long-term, ambitious decarbonization and climate resilient roadmaps, because we look at projects through the eyes of this long-term transition to net zero. In recent years, we've been working a lot with governments in the countries where we work, and actually also with market players, to put in place such roadmaps, because differently from developed countries, very often in the markets where we work, there aren't yet very robust and clear long-term strategies for the sectors or the entire economies. So, for instance, with the government of Uzbekistan, we published last year their vision to net zero by 2050 for the power sector. We are currently working with other governments on power sector decarbonization roadmaps. And also we've been working with large energy intensive sectors like steel, cement. Very recently, with you at the IEA at COP26, we launched the roadmap for the nitrogen fertilizer industry, and we are actually now adapting it to some of the countries where we work. But in a nutshell, the message here is that from the policy and regulatory perspective, it is really crucial that the stakeholders and the policymakers, sometimes with our help, put in place these long-term visions, like in the example below, that tells you very clearly the role of gas and the role of the infrastructure that is meant to deliver this gas to the sector that picture refers to, and also because the picture shows you the evolution of the input over the years. It is also very important to understand how this infrastructure will gradually start transporting different fuels. Natural gas today possibly blends with decarbonized gases tomorrow, and only decarbonized gases thereafter. Because in this sense, then we can look at how we as a financial institution can help market players, TSOs, and other operators in repurposing their assets and their infrastructure to meet the demands of the future. Next slide. So this takes me straight into the work that we are doing in our countries in accelerating the uptake of investment towards low carbon gases. First of all, hydrogen, clearly a very hot topic. You see in the map the gray countries, for those that don't know, EBRD are the countries where we are currently operating, and the colored one are the countries where we are actively working at this moment on supporting governments, putting in place regulatory and market frameworks for the development of low carbon hydrogen. Of course, also for us, like others have mentioned before, the end game is renewable hydrogen, but at this moment we want to keep the door open to all colors of hydrogen, if you want, and help developing a robust, transparent, and rewarding market for low carbon gases and low carbon hydrogen. What I would say the important point here that I want to make is in talking with the policymakers and the governments who have asked us to help developing national hydrogen strategies, is that we begin from the users. It is really important to understand what product the end user needs. Does he need hydrogen as a feedstock to produce other materials? Does he need hydrogen or a low carbon gas as a fuel to replace fossil fuels? And what type of product will the market deliver to its doors? So does the end user, will the end user be happy if it receives ammonia? Will it be happy if it receives a blend where hydrogen is diluted with natural gas? Or will it need pure hydrogen because purity and stability over time is a key condition for its production processes, right? And then on the other hand, we try to understand with the policymakers, looking at the national circumstances and resource availability, where will this product be produced? Or will it be imported? Or will they export? And therefore, combining the needs of the users with the drives of the supply, we can figure out how supply can meet the demand, and therefore what the most sensible backbone for supplying low carbon gases can be. And oftentimes it might be something different than pipelines, but very often also it might actually be dedicated hydrogen pipelines, or rather leveraging on an existing gas infrastructure and repurpose it over time to transport this product. And so in a sense, the message here is we're working quite a lot with the governments in putting in place rewarding market frameworks, which are a precondition to generate bankable projects. An important component that as mentioned before is certification, guarantees of origin. And in this sense, very often the target market for export will be the EU. And so with our countries, we are looking at the European Commission to try, if possible, to accelerate the deployment of the certification standards, because having them in place by the end of 2024 is great. But if this could take place earlier, it would also have a chain effect for the neighboring countries that are in a sense looking from the inside, from the outside into Europe as a leader in setting the scene for these certifications. And with the gas TSOs in some of these countries, we're already working on understanding the technical viability of repurposing existing infrastructure for transporting pure hydrogen, right? Because that's the end of the game. The economic implications, how shall we put in place a robust financial plan to help them repurpose the existing assets? And then, as I just mentioned, the local regulatory frameworks, how can they be rewarding and flexible and allow also to interconnect with the neighboring markets? Next slide. Very briefly on biomethane, our next speaker, as I understand it, will delve into the biomethane regulatory and market frameworks. So I just flag that we are also very open and interested in supporting the uptake of biomethane, including relying on existing gas infrastructure. We are starting our technical support with a few Eastern European countries and in the Baltics. And we are very aware about the cost competitiveness, as mentioned by Maria very recently. And so we have a number of our clients that are very much actively exploring opportunities. There are still some open question marks on the standardization of the product, access to the existing infrastructure. But as I said, I will park any considerations on policies and regulations for the next speaker. And so I just move, if you allow me, to the very last slide that brings us back into the, in a sense, conventional discussions on natural gas pipelines. And therefore, as Tim Gold mentioned this morning, the very topical objective of reducing methane emissions. And we are told, right, that if we come up with a gas infrastructure that minimizes or possibly even completely removes methane emissions, then you are in a great position also to start transporting hydrogen, because it's a much smaller molecule. And so the problem of leaks might just magnify rather than decrease. And we shouldn't forget that hydrogen has, anyway, even if small, but has a global warming potential. So at the level of methane emissions, our approach at this moment is very much working with the governments in increasing the awareness of the scale of emissions and the location. So very much about funding measurement campaigns and activities to set the baselines for methane emissions in these countries. And then working with the gas market players, the transportation companies, primarily the storage companies, in putting in place an investment program to abate methane emissions. From time to time, it might also create an opportunity of monetizing the resulting greenhouse gas savings, although this is not a very straightforward and easy route. And last but not least, help us strengthen the policy and regulatory framework, introducing standards and targets, introducing reporting frameworks for the operators in the countries, and linking to the international community through, for instance, the newly launched Global Methane Pledge, that helps not only putting in place strong measurement and reporting frameworks, but also facilitates the access to finance for this type of interventions. So I think I close here if you want, and then I'm open to questions. I hope I gave some food for thought on the way we are looking at gas infrastructure today that will become the low gas infrastructure of tomorrow. Our constraints, right, coming from our policy and financial requirements, and also the type of activities that we are putting on the table in the countries to accelerate the transition to low carbon solutions.
Thank you very much, Christian. Thanks a lot for the interesting presentation, much appreciated. So in interest of time, I will pass the word to the next speaker, and we will try to address the questions in the Q&A session at the very end. So thanks a lot. And then let me pass to our next speaker, which is Olivier Guérini, Vice President for the Biogas Business Unit at Total Energies, and will give us the view on how adapting the regulatory framework can help in unleashing Europe's biomethane potential. So Olivier, thank you very much for being with us today. And again, the floor is yours.
Thank you, José Miguel. And I'm very happy to be here. Thank you very much for this opportunity to invite an energy company to share its vision about the low carbon gas future. So today I will much more talk about biomethane activities we have here in Total Energy, and what is our vision about the next steps for biomethane framework in terms of regulation and industrial development. So please, yes, next slide, please. The next one. So just to introduce what we are talking about, it's biomethane industry. Maybe some of you know that very well, but it's important to come back to the fundamentals about this industrial pathway. So biomethane, we produce it from waste feedstocks, and we have so much in our developed countries, and not only in Europe. There is wood waste and food waste, everywhere. So we gather this kind of feedstocks coming from farms, coming from cities, coming from industries. So in that industrial pathway, there is a huge challenge to gather those kind of feedstocks. So in that biomethane industry, we are depending a lot about the regulation on the upstream part. So particularly in the states where there is an interest to valorize the feedstocks, where there is an interest to collect the organic feedstocks, it's also very much more easy to make biogas, because the biogas plant is collecting and concentrating those kind of products in order to transform it. So behind of that, there is a biological process. So this concept aimed to produce two kind of products. The biogas, so historically the biogas was used much more to produce electricity and heat through CHP systems. So now the drive is much more on biomethane, because it's one, maybe today, the only one solution to green the natural gas systems. So produce a substitute, a fuel substitute of natural gas, what we name biomethane. What is interesting about biomethane is that you can use it on every kind of appliances of natural gas. You don't need to transform it anymore. You don't need to transform your application. You can use it in every natural gas boiler in the world, or bio-CNG buses, for example, or in natural gas industrial processes, in gas burners, or anything like this. Also in CCGTs, in really thermal gas power plant, you can use a part of biomethane. So it's very interesting, because we know that now we need to green the gas as quick as possible, and biomethane is available today. It can be fully implemented in the industry. The other product that's interesting is the digest, and the digest is an organic residue that is stabilized. It's quite biofertilizer. Today, it's a real product that is very interesting for agriculture, and we know that, for example, in Europe, there is 20% of our emission coming from the agriculture sector. Not only, but a large part come from the fossil fertilizers, and with that kind of bioproduct, we can substitute also emissions on the fertilizer part. So there is those two interests are very much the drivers today for moving fast on biomethane. So at industrial level, I see my predecessor talking about cost effectiveness, and we are working on that together with the other producers in order to implement new industrial systems, digitalize also this kind of product in order to make it much more profitable, much more performance. And there is also other problems or issues or challenges. For example, in sustainability, we need to master better the emissions on those kind of plants. We are working on, and it's better and better. So you see on those kind of products, on the last 10 years, biogas sector has done a lot of progresses in order to improve cost effectiveness. And now there is plenty of plants that are not so far from, for example, 50 to 55 euro per megawatt hour of cost of production, which is very competitive. If you had to natural gas stabilized priced carbon tax of 100 euro per ton, so it's not so far from this. And we can expect, for example, in Europe, a carbon competitive biomethane with natural gas by 2030. I would like to add that as this topic is more globally, it's not right the case in other countries. There is countries where we are producing biomethane at a lower cost than natural gas. The case, for example, is in India. I will come back specifically on that. For example, in India, in Brazil, we can produce biomethane at a cost that is currently competitive with natural gas. So in that configuration, there is no problems to accelerate on those kind of things. It's not the case today in Europe. It's not the case, for example, in US largely. So in those kind of countries, we still need to have a support from the governments to move on. The other part is really now developing the marketing aspects of the biomethane. We see that there is new use of biomethane that is growing up, particularly for mobility. I talk about road transportation, but there is also maritime transportation that is growing on. And we have plenty of demand from that sector. I will come back on that also. And we see that this demand is coming now. And we are able also to scale up this industry with that new marketing demand. So please, next slide. Just to give you a vision about the challenges of our industry for the next 20 years, you see in that graph coming from the European Commission that for Europe, for example, biogas will drive the decarbonation of natural gas for the next 15 years. So it's very important. We hope that hydrogen will come faster to help us to accelerate this decarbonation dynamic, but we need really now to accelerate in that way for biogas. You see the growth of our industry. Today, we are producing in Europe 32 terawatts hour per year of biomethane. So you see that we aim a huge increase in the next year in that way. So our much more important challenge is to scale up our industrial concept and pathway for the next years. And European Commission is counting also on a large part of biomethane in the gas grid by 2050. So maybe more for the appliances that will not be able to shift to hydrogen because they are using biogas and gas for thermal application that cannot shift to electric systems. Next slide, please. On that, you see the start for now. We see that we are not at the scale at the moment, and it's why we are asking a lot of evolution at European level, but also in other countries. We see that there is biomethane in much countries in Europe today. We see that there is countries that are really in advance. The best example is Denmark. Those numbers and figures are from 2020, but I see that last year they've reached much more than 25% of biomethane in their gas grids. So we see that it's fully possible. There is no problem of mix. You can mix 100% of biomethane in the gas grid. There is no change for any application. So it's a bit a no-brainer for plenty of countries that have the potential and want really to accelerate their gas decarbonation. So in Denmark has also a huge farmer industry. So they have feedstocks that can be valorized, but it's quite the same level for Germany or for France, for example, and Netherlands also that have a lot of agriculture industry and that can also lower and accelerate the decarbonization of this agriculture sector and implement biomethane in their gas application. So for the slide at the right, the graph at the right, you see that for Energy Outlook 2021 we published last year, we see that we are expecting a huge implementation of biomethane in different kind of application in a mix with hydrogen. When we can move to a full decarbonized and zero emission systems, we can do it, but there is plenty of application that will not be able to shift as quick as possible to a full electric system. Next slide, please. So just to give you a vision about a good example about what an energy company like TotalEnergies can do on the biomethane sector, I will show you some key elements about what we are doing in the company and what we want to do in the next years. So please, next week. So we have created our biogas business only 2 years ago. So it's very young in TotalEnergies, but we're accelerating a lot because we see that the market is there is a huge demand from our customers, natural gas customers mainly, but not only. We have developed in France, we acquired the leader of biomethane production in France last year. We developed also last year in US. US is a very good example of a huge dynamic market that is much more dynamic than in Europe. They have created a condition of the market that are very attractive and that recognize also the huge level of decarbonisation of the biomethane sector, because in some case biomethane can be carbon negative. So it's get a huge interest for a lot of companies, particularly road transportation sector. Customers like Amazon's or any other have done a lot of announcements on the market last year to fully shift their truck fleet on RNG system. So in US, it's a huge demand to transport goods from these markets. So we have developed a joint venture there, and we are building our first unit there also. We developed also in India, and I told you just a few slides ago that in India we can produce biomethane at a lower price than natural gas. So it's really a nice way, a no-brainer to develop biomethane there, because there is also a huge demand of biofertilizer. They really want to shift from fossil fertilizer to biofertilizer. They have a lot of problem for their production on agriculture, and they really want to shift to that new practices. And so the biogas is a must in order to decarbonize and also to accelerate on their new practices for agriculture. And also we try now to move on new application. I talk about bio-LNG application for maritime transportation, and we signed last year an agreement with CMS CGM to provide them and help them to decarbonize the maritime transportation. So this agreement is real. It's now. It's not for the next 10 years. It's really has been done last year to implement into a big transportation carrier that makes the road coming from China to Europe 13% of bio-LNG into the fuel mix of LNG. So with that kind of things, we can really reduce the emission completely to the maritime transportation sector. Another example is what we are doing with another group, where we have announced at the beginning of this year a huge partnership with Veolia, that is a big environmental company, a global player on that. And in order to get back the biogas coming from landfill or from wastewater treatment plants, sometimes in some countries, this biogas is burned or is not well valorized, and we are working with the Veolia teams in order to scale up this activity and get back this biomethane in order to valorize it into plenty of different applications. So just to give you those examples, because this business is real and there is a huge market demand at the moment. And I think that when the customers look at their capacities, their application, and really their behavior to decarbonize their mix, they see that in biomethane they can use something today and accelerate and really accelerate for the next 10 years and up to 2030 try to decarbonize 100% of their activities. So please, next slide. Just to give you some objective about TotalEnergies, really we want to go to 2 TWh per year by 2025. So it's a huge acceleration. It's an implementation and go to 50 to 60 plants, mainly in US, Europe, and India. But we have other projects in other countries also, and grow up to 6 TWh by 2030. So today we are around 152 people that are globally implicated in the development of those operations through the investments, the developments, the O&M of the plants, but also in the marketing aspects. And it's why it's very important to unleash the potential of biomethane on the marketing aspects, because we see, and we'll come back on a few slides after, we see a lot of barriers in that aspects. Regulation, it's a nightmare sometimes for end users that wants to use biomethane that is produced in the front of their eyes. So it's sometimes very important. It's important to think about the things that will arrive in 20 years, but sometimes we are not looking about the things that are in the front of our eyes. So next slide, please. So yes, the next one, please. If we see an example for in Europe about the different regulation we have today on the road for biogas, we see that it's a bit very complex. There is no country that has the same regulation at the moment. So it's why we don't see today a biogas industry that is at the right scale for decarbonation of natural gas. So we are trying and working with a lot of associations, the European Biogas Association, the World Biogas Association, in order to homogenize those kinds of regulation and try to ask to European Commission not only to put big targets, but also to help the industry to make it possible and try to help producing biogas at the same condition everywhere with the same incentives, and also try to incentivize at the same level the end users application in the different countries. And you see that history of regulation in the different country. Sometimes some countries start 15 years ago, sometimes some countries are starting now. We just saw, for example, for Spain, the news on the beginning of this weeks that they will start with a new regulation to support biomethane. If I compare it to France, that will start 10 years ago, or Germany 15 years ago. So we need really now to open the minds and try to homogenize this kind of ways. The other point is when we want to use biogas on the different countries, if you produce biogas in Germany and want to use it in Spain today, it's not possible. You cannot use branches of origin so easily. So it's a shame because sometimes some countries are much more advanced and there is a demand everywhere that can drive also the development of those new countries. So we want really also to accelerate those kind of things because the biomethane is here. So and the demand is here. So we don't need to wait 15 years or 20 years for new technology. Technology is here, the demand is here, and the production is also here. So the problem is that we cannot do it because there is bottlenecks at regulation level at the moment. And you see just on the right figures that the potential is huge, and we can do it. And every country has a potential on organic waste. Today, large part of that waste is producing methane or CO2 by degrading the atmosphere. So it's also a shame to let those kind of products not to be valorized in a substitute of natural gas that should be available today. So next slide, please. If we try to synthesize, so to scale up this industry, we will need to lift certain regulatory barriers. And in that way, it's not so simple at the moment. We need really to ease the biomethane Euro market through an appropriate certification level. I think this point is not so complex to achieve, but we need really now to accelerate on that. We need also to speed up administrative and authorization procedures. In some countries, it's very simple. In other countries, it's very complex. So when you want really to develop your industry in different countries, you have sometimes a huge gap to fill in order to authorize your plants. If I compare it to US, for example, you can have all your authorization in 6 months. In France, you need 3 years to authorize your plants. In Netherlands, it's 2 years. In Germany, it's 3 years. So there is differences at European level that we cannot really admit at the moment. We have European Commission, we have centralized systems, so we need really now to homogenize those kind of things. Recognize also the renewable nature of biomethane. There is plenty of discussion about that. It depends about the quality and the sustainability of the feedstocks. It's true. And now the industry is moving outside energy crops. For example, in France, it's largely forbidden. So we are developing a lot of plants without any energy crops inside. It's only waste that's coming that. The purpose of the LCA logic is key because in some kind, for example, if you use animal products, you can have a negative emission at the end. So it's very interesting for some customers that really want to decarbonize and accelerate on that. You can provide a negative product at the end. And I don't know any other kind of product that can provide such added value at sustainability level. The other point is to anchor the renewable and low carbon targets in the regulatory frameworks. We see that this kind of things has done a huge bad track for biogas industry in the last 2 years. There was a lot of uncertainty at European level about the need of biomethane in the regulation. We now to put it very clearly in the regulation aspects, and we think that it's really key to stabilize the demand, to stabilize the objectives, and let the industry invest now for the next 10 years. In order to reach the 35 BCM objective that the European Commission has validated on the last weeks. Next slide, please. So for the advocacy for the food industry, so we think that the biomass, the biomass is immediately available. We don't need to mobilize more. There is so much that is now at our door. So we think that it's huge potential to achieve. It's many more. There is no conflict also with that biomass and the other uses. It's not a problem about that. It's not a conflict with any kind of food or feed biomass. It's not this kind of product because we are using waste. So the waste is what people or industry doesn't want in their processes. So it's not really, it's a no-brainer topic, and that we don't need new infrastructure. So if I compare it to H2 methanol ammonia, that will need specific adaptation standards or infrastructure, they will come. But for biogas, we don't need any more investments on the downstream parts. And we think that it's also a very interesting lever for energy independence, because if we are gathering our benefits in that, we can imagine that we can accelerate so much that we can scale up this industry at the right level to improve our independence in terms of gas supply. We think that it's also huge environment benefits for mobility. I talk about road transportation or maritime transportation. When you need a heavy duty transportation with big size of good transportation, for example, you need power to that, and it's very hard to move to electricity systems. So maybe hydrogen can help in the next year, but it's not ready at the moment. So we see that the market has a huge demand for biomethane at the moment. The other point is the positive externalities. We think that it's not only a pathway that produces energy, but also solve a problem for emissions at the upstream for the waste aspects, and particularly in countries where now the collection of organic waste will be much more significant in the next year. We see that we'll be able to catch a lot of new product flow coming from different ways: municipality, people, houses, other industries, supermarkets. All of those kind of products will be driven to biomethane production, and it will help a lot. So there is GHG savings that are our door, and it's a huge benefit at the end. The digestates, I'll talk about biofertilizer, but it's a huge and very interesting product. And we see at the moment with the huge increase, I think it's 5 times prices of the current fossil fertilizer, that it's a real problem now for farmers. We have a solution at our door that is in our hands, and we can control it at 100%. The other point is that this biofertilizer helps to make bioagriculture. So we can also implement a premium in the field of agriculture that will not be allowed with the current fossil fertilizer. And the other point is to breaking down the regulation barriers. It's too long. So we talk a lot about that. And for example, in European sector, it's a real problem. And we see that US has moved very fast on that. And now the US market is largely much more dynamic than the European market. I think that in 2022, the US production of biomethane will double the European production. So I think that market in Europe, it's a 10-year market. US, it's a 3-year market. So you see that US is accelerating because the context and the regulation is much more clear and help us to accelerate and give us a lot of visibility for the next 10 or 15 years for the market that is not today on the paper for Europe, for example. And we need now to translate the Repower target of 35 BCM by 2030. It's concrete, it's real, it's here, but it's not allowed in the different regulation in the countries. So probably a strong push from the European Commission will be needed in that. The other point is to support the marketing aspects for the different uses, and the guarantees of origin is, we think, with the industry that is the best way to do it, like we do for electricity. Biomethane, it's a network energy that can be produced in Denmark and used in Spain, for example, like we do for electricity. We think that we can benefit in Europe, for example, of the large investment we have done in the last 70 years in gas grids. I talk about Maria, about the DSO and the TSO, so they are really our partners to do that, but we need now to overcome our frontier barriers and guarantee us in. We think that it's the good elements and the good systems mechanism to help us. Next slide, please. So if we do really a quick synthesis for it's my last slide, and that we think that really the 35 BCM in 2030, it's really an achievable target. There is a huge challenge to scale up this industry, but there is so many projects now in Europe. We see that we are around 50 terawatts hour of project in the queue at the moment. So where we really are in range to achieve much more of that objectives, and see if European Commission asks us more, we will be able to do more collectively on that. But we need really now to overcome the regulation barrier. It's really it's a regular bottleneck at the moment. It's not helping us. We see that other countries have done very good things, particularly in US, and maybe we can transpose a lot of things coming from those countries because it's working well. And for that, we need to quickly evolve. So also, I will talk about the innovation in conclusion, because I think that we are exiting from the middle age of this industry, and they are now moving in a new age, new era of innovation. And there is plenty of things that will come to improve competitivity, to improve sustainability, to work better and better with the agriculture sector, because it's fully integrated with the agriculture sector. So it's very important, working much more with the food and feed industries. There is plenty of things to do because they need to reduce their emission. We can produce renewable gas. We can also manage the waste. So there is much more integration in that. And there is also innovation in production, because here we talk only about anaerobic digestion. That is the process that is now mature and available, but there is other technology that are moving very fast. Pyrogaseification. We are talking about also e-methane coming from electrolysis and methanation recombination. There is plenty of different pilot planned today, and we aim that those new technology can triple the potential. So today the potential in Europe, it's around 1,000 terawatts hour per year. So we can green between one quarter to 1/3 of the natural gas consumption. But with the new technology, we can move to 3,000 terawatts hour per year. So it can allow us a lot of renewable gas in the systems, and we hope that those technology will be able to be implemented in the next 10 years. Thank you very much. If you have some question.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Much appreciated. And we have now a bit more than 5 minutes for the Q&A session, and we have received several questions already in the chat, some others internally. So I will pick some of them and directed to the different speakers. I mean, I will direct one of you, but of course, if any of the other speakers wants to address any of the questions, please do not hesitate. So the next one, I'm going to combine two questions for you, Justin. First one is about the time where the Delegate Act will be available, so by 2024, and whether it could delay investments on low carbon hydrogen. And I think somehow related, not to that question currently, but to the Delegated Act, is whether there is a scope for a standard European LCA methodology for hydrogen.
Thanks very much, and it's a very good question on the 2024 timeline. Let me firstly explain indeed that there's a distinction between low carbon hydrogen and renewable low carbon hydrogen and renewable hydrogen. So let's say the criteria to define an renewable hydrogen that is produced with electricity sourced from the grid will be part of a delegated act that is upcoming and will be proposed under the RED. And the 2024 indeed is related to low carbon hydrogen. Now, obviously the problem is primarily legal, because we cannot, in essence, adopt a delegated act if the, let's say, primary legislative act is not adopted yet. And as we have set out, that the delegated act will follow the adoption of the package, and the adoption of the package, well, the negotiations on the package should still start between Parliament and Council. I think it's fair to say that 2024 is perhaps the most earliest moment possible that it will be adopted. But another aspect of is I wanted to give is we haven't set targets for low carbon hydrogen, and I think that the definition of the delegated act is primarily meant to create certainty, the delegated act for renewable hydrogen, to create certainty on what is the framework under which member states are allowed to subsidize renewable hydrogen. One might ask whether subsidization of low carbon hydrogen is wishful, and apart from that, it's obvious that one is allowed to start with producing and consider it low carbon hydrogen, but we aim not to incentivize its use. So partially there's a legal reason for this. Secondly, we don't have targets, so there might not be directly a reason to come up earlier. And thirdly, I think it's always possible if member states decide, okay, this type of hydrogen, we would like to use it in our energy mix, they could decide to already start with it, although it would not be named low carbon hydrogen yet under a European definition. And then there was one other question, but I did not entirely understand what you were referring to.
So the question is whether there is a scope for a standard European LCA methodology for hydrogen. So my understanding to evaluate the carbon footprint of hydrogen production.
In essence, that's I think the goal of the legislation. I think you refer to a life cycle emissions assessment, or yeah,
Exactly.
it's I should say that it's quite technical. We aim for it. I should say that it's a question that I can also answer in written if wishful afterwards, because I might want to liaise with the concrete experts within our unit. But in any event, that's what we aim for. So we have proposed it in the legislation, so that's what we should aim for.
Thank you very much, Justin. So Maria, there was a question placed in the Q&A box for you. I saw that you answered in writing, but if you want to elaborate a bit more, which is about whether regional interconnectivity, in this case between Spain and France, could be used for LNG and then hydrogen, and whether it's likely that more LNG interconnectivity will be built in the short term, could be repurposed for hydrogen. And I wanted to ask you that because we have been receiving other requests ourselves, whether the current investments on LNG capacity could be a low regret option for then the reconversion into hydrogen later in the transition to cleaner fuels. So I wanted to hear your opinion on that front.
Thank you, Jose. Yeah, as I pointed out, the Iberian Peninsula accounts for more than 30% of the current regasification capacity in the European Union. Our LNG terminals can play a role in the short term, but as per the Repower EU plan, all new infrastructure, including interconnectors, have to be built hydrogen ready. The idea is to prepare. We could use temporarily these existing and future interconnections for increasing our exports to Central European markets through France. I would like to also to point out that I fully agree with Olivier that Spain and France are partners in this, and we are working closely. Collaboration between TSOs and coordination is excellent. But of course, the aim is to reduce dependency from fossil fuels. All our plans, including repurposing of existing pipelines, aim at transporting as much green hydrogen as possible once the domestic production in Spain takes off. And this will require, of course, to scale up the support from European Union for at the IPCEI and IPCEI level in order for this to take place as soon as possible.
Thanks a lot, Maria. Actually, just speaking on this last point about the required support, I want to pass to Christian and ask you, Christian, so what regulators and perhaps public investors as well could do to facilitate investments in pipeline repurposing or other existing infrastructure repurposing, and how regulatory frameworks could help in making these investments more attractive or more easy to be faced?
I think there is a distinction between private sector investment and state-owned entities that operate under monopoly, right? But I think at this moment, the projects, and let me answer more broadly, right? But the type of projects that we are considering for finance in the context of the entire supply chain of low carbon gases are exposed to relatively material risk that stems from unclarity on regulations and market frameworks, right? So the early movers are taking a lot of risk in this uncertain period. There was Justin was answering a very important question on the fact that some investments might move forward in absence of a confidence that the product will be certified as low carbon or green, right? And so it is very difficult at this moment to have predictability and stability, and that's the primary role of the regulations early on in the game. They should put very clear targets in Europe. The EU hydrogen strategy has achieved this goal, right? But the risk at this moment is still that the market rules are not yet clear and they are subject to change. So the earliest policymakers can shed some more light and increase the confidence in private sector investment, and the easier it will be to see results in terms of material projects. There is an opportunity, there is an overarching strong will and commitment from the authorities, but the detailed primary and secondary legislation is still in some cases absent, and so that is a real bottleneck. That's also why I was before calling for speeding up this process on certification, because really you have exporting markets at the borders of Europe that have extremely cost competitive conditions to generate very relatively low price commodity for export into Europe, as well as use in their domestic markets. But we need to give this confidence that the governments and these neighboring countries can link up with the regional market and also the investors, that they can have a return on their investment. So I think the rules should really put in place the conditions for the game.
Thank you very much, Christian. And Oliver, I have for you a question as an internal question, but I wanted to raise it here. So there is also a question around biomethane. Just to mention, we have only 2 minutes for finishing the Q&A, so if you could please be brief. But the question is, well, Maria mentioned, for example, that today with current natural gas prices, biomethane is already competitive. But we wanted to hear from a producer whether you see a scope for cost reduction, for further cost reduction. So the cost of biomethane could be competitive even if in other scenarios where natural gas could come back to more normal prices than those that we are seeing today.
If Lucien is okay, I will take the answer. So just for a reminder, we are currently in Europe producing biomethane between 50 euros per megawatt hour to around 120 euro per megawatt hour, depending on the country, depending on the size of the plant. If you have 2 small plants, the cost of production is much more higher. If you go to Denmark, which they are the big plants, you can achieve around 50 euro per megawatt hour. So when you look at those lower costs, it's not so far from the cost of natural gas plus a carbon tax of 100 euro per ton that would increase the price of natural gas by around 20 euro per megawatt hour. So we're not so far towards something that is competitive. So that there is 2 challenges. It's really to industrialize this pathway. It's what Denmark has done, because Denmark is doing one concept and try to improve the concept generation after generation. So each new plant improving the cost. We are not doing that today in France, because France, it's much more farmers that are doing, for example, the plants. So they are not able to do a second one or third one. They are only doing one. So they cannot learn from their difficulties or try to improve the processes at the end. It's why we are trying now to change that market and to evolve to something that can implement like the other industry are doing. And we really need now to do it at European level. The other point to improve the cost, it's also to unleash the potential of the biofertilizer, because today we are not selling the biofertilizer in Europe. It's not the case in some states in the US or in India. Sometimes biofertilizer can represent 50% of the revenues at the end, so it can also help to lower the cost. So at the end, we're not so far from the natural gas price. It's quite the same, and the case today, in India. In India, we are around 10 to 20% lower in cost of production than the natural gas. So these 2 points, industrialize, scaling up, and also unleash the potential of the biofertilizer valorization. We cannot hear you, Jose.
Sorry, thanks for letting me know. So thanks a lot for the answer and for the answer of all the speakers. I think that with that, we have to put a close to this session. Again, thank you very much to all of you for your valuable contributions. It's been a pleasure, and we hope to have the opportunity to participate in other sessions with all of you. And now for closing this low carbon gas day, I will pass the word to our Director of Energy Markets and Security, Keske Sadamori. So Keske, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Jose. Dear colleagues, the IEA Low Carbon Gas Day is coming to an end, and we would like to thank all our speakers and moderators for sharing insights on biomethane, synthetic methane, and low carbon hydrogen. The IEA ministerial meeting, which ended yesterday, provided the IEA with strong mandates on leading the global energy sector's fight against the climate change, and also expanding its role in energy security. The low carbon gases are today at the intersection of energy supply security and decarbonization efforts. Besides contributing to lower emission pathways, domestically produced low carbon gases, the enhanced market resilience and can reduce significantly the reliance on fossil fuel imports already in the short term. Please allow me to share 5 key takeaways from today's Low Carbon Gas Day. So first, the low carbon fuels and gases are playing a key role in all decarbonization pathways. In our World Energy Outlook, WEO, net zero by 2050 scenario, the low carbon fuels account for about half of total energy consumption by 2050. Second, the private sector will be the driving force behind the technology innovation and cost reduction, enabling the large-scale deployment of low carbon gases. Third, policies and regulations will be key in creating an enabling framework for investments, where the low carbon fuels and gases are supported accordingly to their benefits in reducing emissions. Fourth, an orderly transition from the current gas systems to a model integrating multiple gases will require prudent market design and constant dialogue between the public and the private sectors. And last but not least, fifth, the international dialogue will be crucial in years to come to facilitate innovation, sharing of best practices, and allow for the scale up of regional and the long distance trade of low carbon fuels and gases. We believe that the IEA is well placed to promote an in-depth dialogue among the regulators, policymakers, and private stakeholders on the system integration of low carbon gases, as well as facilitate the international sharing of best practices. I would like to thank you all again for your contributions, and I look forward to continuing discussion on this very important topic.